Story 1. The Pharaoh who ruled as a woman. You picture yourself in the quiet coolness of a limestone temple, where the painted walls still carry faint traces of ochre, blue, and green. The light is dim, filtered through narrow slits that once guided priests, scribes, and servants. In the stillness, you notice the carved images. A pharaoh, towering and regal, wearing the ceremonial beard of kingship. But then, as your eyes adjust, something strange begins to appear. The pharaoh is not always shown with the broad chest and strong chin of a man. Sometimes the features are softer, the figure more slender, and the body unmistakably feminine. This is Hatshepsut, the pharaoh who ruled Egypt for over 2 decades during the 18th dynasty, around 1479 to 1458 BCE, to most Americans today. Her name is barely familiar compared to the golden boy Tutankhamun or the great builder Ramesses II. Yet, in her time, she reshaped the identity of Egyptian kingship itself, ruling not as a queen alongside her husband, but as pharaoh in her own right. The detail that many overlooked, the one that feels almost boring, how she managed to present herself on temple walls. Day after day, artisans were instructed to carve her wearing the royal kilt, the Nena's headdress, and even the false beard that was the emblem of kingship. It was not a theatrical disguise, but a deliberate redefinition. Pharaoh, she insisted, was not a man, it was an office, a divine embodiment of Horus, the falcon god of kingship. And if that office required a beard, then a beard she would wear. You can almost imagine the endless discussions behind the scenes, the scribes drafting new titles for her, the priests negotiating which rituals she could perform, and the artisans carefully chiseling away at the stone to make her appear more masculine when needed, and more feminine when ceremony allowed. It was not a single moment of rebellion, but rather a slow, steady layering of identity, carved literally into the walls of Egypt. For the ordinary people of Egypt, Hatshepsut's reign may not have seemed so radical. Taxes still had to be paid, fields still had to be sown, and festivals still filled the calendar. But for the priesthood and the noble families who surrounded the throne, this was a balancing act like no other. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I, the widow of Thutmose II, and the regent for the young Thutmose III. She might have stayed in the shadows, as many regents had done before, quietly managing affairs, until the boy came of age. Instead, she declared herself pharaoh. The way she did it was subtle, boring even to modern eyes, yet historically revolutionary. She did not stage a coup or seize power through bloodshed. She issued proclamations wrapped in religious authority, claimed divine approval through the oracle of Amen, and slowly changed her titles from God's wife of Amen to king of Upper and Lower Egypt. It was paperwork, ceremony, and ritual more than war and violence. It was the dull machinery of state that, step by step, placed her on the throne in many ways. This is what makes her story so fascinating for a sleep-time exploration. Power was not only swords and battles, but also lists, titles, and names inscribed on temple pylons. Imagine yourself as one of the temple scribes, dipping your reed brush into black ink, carefully copying her royal titulary again and again. Hatshepsut, each word, each stroke, reinforced her claim, the great monument of her reign. The mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari rose from the desert cliffs in terraces of pale stone. Even here, the boring but essential details tell us her story. Ramps were measured and aligned with astronomical precision. Columns were cut, transported, and placed in perfect rows. Reliefs were carved depicting her divine birth, showing the god Amen himself fathering her. It was a bureaucratic miracle as much as a spiritual one, where teams of engineers, architects, and workmen brought order to stone. But what is most striking, and perhaps most mysterious, is how she managed to maintain stability during her reign. Egypt was at peace, its wealth flowing from trade with Punt, its temples enriched, its population nourished by the annual Nile flood. And yet, after her death, Thutmose III began a slow campaign to erase her from history. Statues were smashed, her name was chiseled out, and for centuries her reign was reduced to a whisper in the stones. Why? Some historians say it was revenge. For taking the throne he believed was his. Others argue it was a political strategy to restore the appearance of male continuity in kingship. Still others suggest it was simply a matter of practicality, clearing space for his own monuments. Whatever the reason, it leaves us with a tantalizing Gapa queen who ruled as pharaoh, but who almost vanished from the record. And so, as you sit within the silent halls of her temple, you might wonder if history had not nearly erased her. Would the idea of female kingship have become more accepted in the centuries that followed? Or was Hatshepsut always destined to be an exception, a bold experiment in redefining power that could not endure? When you think of a pharaoh, you might picture grand battles, thunderous chariots, an army stretching across the desert horizon. But for Hatshepsut, much of her power rested not in war, but in the more tedious details of governance, the routines of administration, the logistics of supply, and the rhythms of trade. In many ways, her rule was marked by what might seem, on the surface, as boring continuity. She kept Egypt stable. There was no great famine, no crippling invasion, no upheaval that undid the state. And in that stability lay her genius. Each morning, Hatshepsut would be attended by scribes and priests who read out lists of offerings, lists of taxes, lists of materials delivered to her building projects, bread and beer for the workers, copper and turquoise brought from the Sinai, fine incense from Punt, gold from Nubia, stone quarried from Aswan. The day-to-day mechanics of empire were not flashy, but they built the foundation for her legacy. It is here that her most famous achievement took shape, the expedition to Punt. Today, the land of Punt is uncertain in its exact location, somewhere near the Red Sea, perhaps modern Eritrea or Somalia. But to the Egyptians, it was the source of wonders. Trees that oozed precious resin, exotic animals never before seen, gold and ebony, ivory and spices. Imagine yourself as one of the sailors preparing for that journey. Weeks spent shaping wooden planks into long, narrow ships, ropes coiled neatly, oars lined up like the teeth of a comb. Supplies grain, water jars, dried fish, loaded in careful order. The smell of tar as the seams are sealed. And then the long voyage down the Red Sea, the waves slapping against the hull, the heat pressing down. On the walls of Hatshepsut Temple at Deir el-Bahari, these expeditions are carved in vivid detail. You can still see the images today, strange trees being uprooted to be transplanted back in Egypt, ships loaded with exotic goods, the Puntite queen with her distinctive body shape, standing beside her husband. For the Egyptians who saw these images, it was proof that their pharaoh not only maintained order, but expanded prosperity. What is remarkable here is not conquest, but connection. Hatshepsut's reign shows us a different way of imagining power, not through endless war, but through steady networks of exchange. The boring details, how many jars of incense, how many lengths of ebony, how many bundles of myrrh, the lifeblood of her rule. Back in Thebes, these imports transformed temple rituals. Priests burned incense before the statues of the gods, filling the air with fragrance. Gold and ivory adorned shrines. Exotic animals were paraded during festivals. The wealth of Punt became a sensory experience for ordinary Egyptians, linking Hatshepsut's image to abundance and divine favor. Yet beyond trade, her reign was equally defined by building. To understand her Egypt is to picture the sound of chisels tapping against stone, the grunting of workers hauling blocks, the constant hum of construction. At Karnak, she ordered 2 massive obelisks, each weighing hundreds of tons, raised in honor of Ammon at Deir el-Bahri, her mortuary temple, spread across 3 terraces, each with colonnades of columns. Consider the sheer organization required: quarrying sandstone from Gebel el-Sulsila, cutting the blocks to precise measurements, floating them down the Nile at just the right time when the floodwaters allowed transport, dragging them across sand using sledges lubricated with water, and then the endless task of fitting, carving, and smoothing. For modern viewers, these are technical details, but for Hatshepsut, they were tools of propaganda. Each stone placed was another statement. Pharaoh rules here. Pharaoh builds for eternity. Pharaoh has the approval of the gods. Daily governance under her reign also meant balancing the presence of Thutmose III, the young boy she had technically replaced. Reliefs often show them together, but in practice, she was the dominant figure. Some historians argue she kept him sidelined, allowing him to train in military arts while she focused on administration. Others suggest a kind of curule, where she presented him ceremonially while holding the true power. Whatever the case, it was a delicate balance that required constant negotiation with court officials. Her officials themselves are worth noting. Sennemut, her trusted advisor and architect, appears again and again in the archaeological record. He oversaw building projects, managed estates, and likely coordinated the Punt expedition. For years, scholars speculated about his relationship with Hatshepsut, whether it was purely political or also personal. But what matters more is the boring but essential fact: she relied on competent administrators. Without them, her reign would have collapsed. When you look at Hatshepsut's reign this way, the drama lies not in a single moment, but in the slow accumulation of small decisions. She taxed fairly, kept the Nile Valley orderly, invested in trade, enriched temples, and built monuments that proclaimed her authority. It is a model of rule through quiet steadiness, through attention to detail rather than bold spectacle. But there was always an undercurrent of fragility. The fact that she dressed as a male pharaoh, that she commissioned reliefs claiming divine birth, that she filled her monuments with messages about legitimacy, these all suggest that her rule, while successful, was never entirely secure. Perhaps the most telling sign is this: she never remarried. Most queens who rose to prominence were tied to a king through marriage. But Hatshepsut kept her independence. She ruled not as someone's wife, but as Pharaoh herself. That decision gave her power, but it also left her vulnerable. Without a dynastic partner, her legitimacy always had to be reinforced through ritual, stone, and story. So when you walk through her temple and you see the long rows of reliefs showing her offerings to the gods, you can almost hear the unspoken question: was this enough? Was legitimacy something that could be carved into stone, or did it always risk being erased? And so Section 2 closes, with Hatshepsut at the height of her reign, wealth flowing from Punt, temples rising in her name, Egypt stable under her rule. Yet beneath the calm, the question lingers. What happens when the boy Pharaoh grows into a man? You imagine the last years of Hatshepsut's reign not as a blaze of drama, but as a steady continuation of the routines that had defined her rule. The Nile still rose each year, flooding the fields and leaving behind the fertile black soil that fed the population. The temples still echoed with ritual chants. The quarry still rang with the sound of chisels cutting stone in the background. However, the boy who had once been her ward was growing into a man. Thutmose III, the rightful heir she had overshadowed, spent much of his early years as a junior partner in name only. Hatshepsut had ensured that Egypt was stable, and she had trained him, deliberately or not, in the arts of war and kingship. When he finally came to power on his own, he would become one of Egypt's greatest military pharaohs. But in the twilight of Hatshepsut's rule, he remained a presence waiting in the wings. For Hatshepsut herself, the later years were marked by consolidation. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari was nearing completion, its terraces aligned with the cliffs behind it, a monument unlike anything built before. Reliefs continued to multiply rows upon rows of processions, offerings, gods, and proclamations of her divine legitimacy. Every detail served as reinforcement. She was not merely a queen, not merely a regent, but Pharaoh, chosen by the gods. And yet, there is no grand record of her death. No inscription announcing her passing, no festival commemorating her reign. Like many rulers of Egypt, her final breath was swallowed by the desert, leaving historians to piece together her fate from fragments. Some evidence suggests she may have suffered from bone disease, perhaps even cancer. Others point to dental infections as a possible cause. In any case, her death, around 1458 BCE, passed quietly into the machinery of succession. Thutmose III, no longer the sidelined boy, now ruled alone. It was in the years after her death that her legacy faced its greatest trial. Slowly, systematically, her name began to be erased from monuments. Statues of her were smashed. Her images on temple walls were chiseled out. Reliefs once showing her as pharaoh were recarved to display Thutmose III or his successors. Even her obelisks at Karnak were enclosed within walls, hidden from view. The erasure was not immediate, but deliberate. It unfolded over decades, a long campaign of silence. To later generations, it must have seemed as if Hatshepsut had never ruled at all. Her story slipped into the shadows, lost beneath layers of stone and time. Why did this happen? Historians still debate. Some argue that Thutmose III sought revenge, removing the memory of the woman who had claimed his throne. Others suggest it was less personal and more political, an effort to restore the appearance of an unbroken line of male kings. Still others think it was practical, a way to clear space for new monuments and inscriptions. What is striking, however, is that this erasure was not total. Enough remain fragments of statues, faint traces of her name, hidden reliefs that her existence could not be completely destroyed. She had been a pharaoh, and though later scribes tried to deny it, the stone still whispered her name. Centuries passed. The desert buried her temples in sand, and her reign became a ghost in the chronicles of Egypt. To the Greeks and Romans who later studied Egyptian history, she was little more than a rumor. To medieval travelers, she was unknown. For Americans today, she is often just a passing name in textbooks, overshadowed by Tutankhamun's golden mask or Cleopatra's tragic romance. But in the 19th century, when European explorers and archaeologists began to uncover the ruins of Egypt, her story re-emerged. At Deir el-Bahari, they found her temple, still rising against the cliffs. Inscriptions told of her divine birth, her expedition to Punt, her years as pharaoh. Bit by bit, scholars piece together the forgotten tale of the woman who had ruled. As king, the rediscovery of her mummy is another layer of mystery. For years, her body was missing. Tombs were examined, mummies unwrapped, yet none seemed to match. It was only in 2007, after DNA analysis and CT scans, that researchers announced they had likely identified her remains among unidentified mummies in the Valley of the Kings. If true, she had lain in anonymity for thousands of years, her identity nearly erased, only to be revealed again by modern science. As you sit with this story, you begin to see the quiet irony. Hatshepsut had built her reign on the careful accumulation of detailed stone reliefs, inscriptions, rituals, and ceremonies, designed to reinforce her legitimacy. After her death, those same details became the focus of erasure. Her name was scratched out stroke by stroke, her images carved away chisel by chisel. And yet, it is the details that endured. A faint inscription here, a hidden statue fragment there, enough for her story to be pieced together again. What remains today is both fragile and powerful. In museums, you can see the shattered faces of her statues, deliberately mutilated by those who came after her. In Luxor, you can walk among her obelisks, still towering despite the walls once built to hide them. In her temple, you can read her proclamations of divine birth, still carved in stone, still telling her side of the story. It leaves you with a question as you drift into thought. How many other rulers, kings and queens have been erased so thoroughly that their stories will never be rediscovered? If Hatshepsut's memory survived only by chance, how much of history has vanished beyond recall? Story 2. The Pharaoh who worshipped only the sun. Picture yourself standing beneath the glaring Egyptian sun, the heat pressing on your shoulders, the air shimmering like a curtain of glass. In front of you rises a city not like the stone temples of Thebes, but a new capital carved hastily from the desert, Akhenaten, the horizon of the sun. Here, the Pharaoh Akhenaten proclaimed a vision unlike any before him that Egypt would abandon its many gods and worship one, the Aten, the radiant sun disk dot. Americans today may know Tutankhamun, his young son, because of the treasures of his tomb. But the father's name, Akhenaten, is often left in the margins. His reign, around 1353 to 1336 BCE, was a radical experiment that shook the foundations of Egypt's religion, art, and society. What made it remarkable was not only the boldness of the vision, but also the details, the boring but revolutionary ways in which Akhenaten restructured daily life to reflect his new theology. Temples that once hummed with the smell of incense to dozens of gods were stripped down and opened to the blazing. Sky priests who had long guarded their cults were pushed aside. Statues of Amun, Osiris, and Ptah were smashed, their names erased from inscriptions. In their place, sunlight itself became the focus of devotion. In the reliefs that survive, you can still see how Akhenaten reshaped art. No longer were pharaohs shown in stiff, idealized poses. Instead, the king appeared with elongated features, heavy lips, and a soft belly. He was pictured with his wife, Nefertiti, and their daughters, under the rays of Aten, each sunbeam ending in a tiny hand that offered life. These images, while strange to modern eyes, were carefully composed propaganda. They declared that Akhenaten and his family were the chosen mediators of the Aten's light. But what was it like for ordinary Egyptians? Imagine a farmer, rising at dawn to tend his fields. For generations, he had prayed to the local gods of his village, perhaps Sobek, the crocodile god, or Hathor, the cow goddess of fertility. Now, officials ordered that only Aten should be honored. The farmer still tilled his land, still worried about the Nile flood, still hoped his children would grow strong, but the familiar statues in his shrine were removed, the names of his gods carved out of stone. He was told to look instead at the sun disk, rising each morning, blazing at noon, fading at dusk. This shift was not simply spiritual, but administrative. The priesthood of Amen at Thebes, once one of the most powerful institutions in Egypt, lost its wealth and influence. Lands and estates that had belonged to temples were seized by the crown. Akhenaten redirected resources toward his new city, Akhetaten, where construction boomed. Blocks of Talatotmol standardized limestone bricks were cut, hauled, and stacked with speed. Rows of temples, palaces, and villas appeared, all aligned to the path of the sun. It must have been a strange city. Unlike the monumental temples of Karnak, Akhetaten's shrines were roofless, exposing worshippers to the blazing sky. Offerings of bread, beer, and cattle were piled high, not before statues, but beneath the open sun. The architecture itself reinforced the theology. There was no dark inner chamber for a god statue, no sanctuary hidden from view. Everything was bathed in light. Day-to-day governance continued. Of course, taxes still had to be collected, harvests stored, labor organized. But every document, every inscription now bore the mark of Aten. Even official correspondence shifted. In the famous Amarna letters clay tablets preserved in cuneiform you see the pharaoh's attention focused outward, communicating with kings of Babylon, Mitanni, and the Hittites. Yet within Egypt, he turned inward, cutting ties with tradition in favor of a singular vision. The results were disruptive. Temples that had anchored communities for centuries were neglected. Local priests found themselves unemployed or stripped of power. Festivals that once filled the streets with music and dance grew silent. The rhythms of ordinary life were unsettled. And what of Nefertiti, his queen? She appears alongside him in nearly every depiction, sometimes performing rituals usually reserved for Pharaoh. Her presence was not ornamental but central, reinforcing the image of a divine family illuminated by Aten's rays. Together, they modeled a new way of being, Pharaoh and consort. Not distant gods on earth, but visible, affectionate figures under the sun. Reliefs show them kissing their children, playing together. A striking departure from the formal art of earlier dynasties. To us, it might look almost humanizing, but to their subjects, it may have seemed strange, even unsettling. For centuries, Pharaoh had been distant, majestic, larger than life. Now, he appeared soft, almost fragile, his image distorted. Was it honesty, theology, or propaganda of a different kind? Scholars still debate, yet behind the revolution, you can sense the fragility. Akhenaten's changes were bold but shallow, rooted more in decree than in tradition. The people may have obeyed out of duty, but how deeply did they believe? The old gods had been worshipped for millennia. Could they truly be replaced by a blazing disk? As you stand in the imagined ruins of Akhetaten, with the desert wind blowing across broken columns, the question lingers. What was Akhenaten truly after? Was it a sincere belief in the Aten as the sole divine power? Or was it a political maneuver, stripping power from the priesthood of Amen and centralizing it in his own hands? The stones do not answer. They only remind us that a pharaoh once dared to change not only religion, but the very way people imagined their world, and in doing so, he carved a fragile dream into the desert. You imagine walking through Akhenaten's city, as the sun climbs high overhead. The streets are wide and ordered, laid out in a grid that feels almost modern compared to the twisting lanes of older towns. Dust rises under your feet. Everywhere you look, the Aten shines. Temples stand open too. The sky, their columns plain compared to the carved grandeur of Thebes. Priests shuffle past, not in shadowy sanctuaries, but beneath the burning light. They carry trays of offerings, bread stacked neatly, jugs of beer sloshing, freshly slaughtered cattle. Instead of being placed before the statues of Ammon or Osiris, these offerings are laid on open altars, exposed to the heat. The sun itself is meant to consume them. For the average citizen, life in Akhenaten must have felt both ordinary and unfamiliar. Workmen rose at dawn, their bodies stiff from sleeping on reed mats, their bellies filled with bread and beer. They carried tools, chisels, mallets, and walked to the construction sites that seemed never-ending. Akhenaten's dream city was built quickly, almost recklessly, from small limestone blocks known as talat. These could be carried by 2 men, laid down swiftly, and replaced just as quickly if designs changed. Everywhere, walls went up. Palaces, villas, warehouses, and stables sprang from the desert. At the center stood the great temple of Aten, a sprawling complex with courts that opened directly to the blazing sun. Reliefs showed Akhenaten and Nefertiti beneath Aten's rays, their elongated bodies offering gifts while their daughters sat on their laps. For the people who carved these images, the work was routine, chisel after chisel, line after line, yet the message was revolutionary. Inside homes, daily life carried its own rhythms. Archaeologists have found small shrines in houses, many depicting Aten as a sun disk with rays ending in hands. But alongside these, hidden away, were figures of the old gods, amulets of base, the household protector, or Tauret, the hippo goddess of childbirth. Even as Akhenaten proclaimed Aten as the sole god, the ordinary families of Akhenaten clung quietly to traditions. In the privacy of their homes, the gods were not so easily erased. The city itself bore marks of haste. Walls sometimes leaned, buildings cracked, repairs were frequent. Yet it was filled with life. Merchants selling goods, children running barefoot, scribes hunched over papyrus scrolls, recording deliveries of grain or cattle. Soldiers patrolled, keeping order. The hum of labor never ceased, but beneath the busyness lay a subtle tension. Akhenaten had cut deeply into the power of the Amen priesthood, and with it, the traditional economy of temples that had fed thousands. Lands that once belonged to Amen's priests were seized. Officials loyal to Akhenaten replaced the old hierarchies. Some embraced the change after all. New opportunities meant new wealth. Others surely resented it, their authority undermined. By the Pharaoh's revolution, the art of the city reflected this strangeness. Gone were the stiff, muscular depictions of kings as perfect warriors. Instead, Akhenaten was shown with narrow shoulders, wide hips, and an elongated skull. Scholars still debate whether this was a medical condition, a theological statement, or simply a new artistic style. What is clear is that it was deliberate. By showing himself and his family in unconventional forms, Akhenaten broke with millennia of tradition. He was different, and he wanted Egypt to see it. You can imagine the confusion this caused. Priests who had once bowed before the majestic statues of Ammon now saw their Pharaoh, depicted with sagging chins and a protruding belly. Soldiers who had marched in lines of discipline now saw their king shown kissing his daughters. For ordinary Egyptians, this must have felt both intimate and unsettling. A ruler was supposed to embody eternity, not frailty. The festivals of a also differed. Gone were the grand processions of statues carried through the streets, the secretive rituals performed in shadowed halls. Instead, the Aten's light was the ceremony. Crowds gathered in open courts, chanting hymns to the sun disk as offerings piled high. Hymns survive that describe Aten rising each day, giving life to the world. The words are poetic, but the practice may have felt monotonous, each festival blurring into the next beneath the relentless glare. Meanwhile, in the wider empire, cracks began to appear. The Amarna letters clade tablets discovered in the ruins of Akhetaten reveal foreign rulers pleading for help. Vassal kings in Canaan and Syria wrote desperate messages. Enemies were attacking. Allies were rebelling. Territories were slipping away. They begged for troops, for supplies, for Pharaoh's attention. Too often, no help came. Akhenaten was focused on his vision at home, his attention fixed on the Aten rather than the geopolitics of empire. This neglect weakened Egypt's hold on its territories. Soldiers grumbled, officials fretted, and foreign powers grew bold. Yet within Akhetaten life went on. Workers hammered at stones, priests raised their hands to the sun, scribes copied hymns, and the royal family continued to present itself as the chosen mediators of divine light. But what of the people? Imagine yourself as a farmer outside the city. You rise before dawn, plow your fields, and hope for a good Nile flood. You have little choice in what gods you may honor publicly, but at night you whisper prayers to the old deities. Perhaps you place a small amulet under your pillow, hoping that Turet will protect your newborn child. Perhaps you carry a scarab in your pocket, a quiet reminder of rebirth and continuity. The official story may be Aten, but in the quiet corners of daily life, Egypt's ancient religion endures. This is what makes Akhenaten's revolution so fascinating. On the surface, it was radical temples emptied, gods erased, art transformed. But underneath, the old rhythms of belief continued, stubborn and resilient. The Aten shone brightly in public, but in the shadows of homes. The old gods waited. As you picture the city at dusk, the sun sinking behind the desert cliffs, the light fading, the question arises: could a religion based solely on the blazing sun survive the darkness of night? The desert remembers silence better than sound. Today, the ruins of Akhetaten lie scattered and broken, half buried in sand. Columns stand like bones, walls crumble into dust. It is a ghost city. But once, this was the beating heart of Akhenaten's vision, a vision that collapsed almost as quickly as it rose. Toward the end of his reign, Akhenaten faced a fragile empire. While he dedicated himself to Aten, Egypt's borders trembled. The Amarna letters show vassal kings pleading for help. Send archers. Send troops. Without your aid, we are lost. Too often, Akhenaten ignored them. Scholars debate whether this was neglect, obsession, or deliberate withdrawal from foreign entanglements. Whatever the cause, Egypt's hold on its territories weakened inside Egypt. Discontent simmered. The cult of Ammon, once rich and powerful, had been stripped of lands and temples. Priests who had overseen vast estates were now sidelined. Ordinary people, still whispering prayers to their household gods, must have felt uneasy living under a system that forbade the very deities their ancestors had honored for centuries. A city, built in haste, also showed signs of fragility. Houses needed constant repair, walls cracked. Supplies had to be hauled from far-off quarries and fields, straining resources. The dream of a perfect city dedicated to Aten was beautiful on stone walls, but far less sustainable in daily practice. And then came death. Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE, after 17 years on the throne. How he died is uncertain: illness, age, or perhaps the result of neglecting his own health in the desert heat. What mattered was what came after. His successor, possibly a ruler known as Smenkhare, reigned only briefly. Soon after, a boy took the throne, Tutankhamun, son of Akhenaten. But within a few years, his name changed. The Aten was abandoned, and the boy became Tutankhamun. This name change was more than cosmetic. It marked the undoing of Akhenaten's revolution. Temples to Aten were closed. The capital city of Akhetaten was abandoned, left to crumble in the desert. The cult of Amon was restored to power, its priests returning to their temples with renewed authority. Inscriptions of Aten were erased, chiseled away with determination. Akhenaten himself was condemned to damnatio memoria, the erasure of memory. For centuries, his reign was barely mentioned. Later, Egyptians called him the heretic king. His statues were smashed, his name omitted from king lists, his experiment written out of official history. Why such hostility? Partly because his revolution had attacked the very foundations of Egyptian religion. By elevating Aten above all, Akhenaten had stripped the old gods of their roles, leaving their priesthoods powerless. In restoring tradition, later rulers wanted to seal that wound by pretending it had never existed, and yet fragments survived. In the ruins of Akhetaten, inscriptions lay buried beneath sand. Reliefs of Aten's rays still lingered on broken walls. The Amarna letters, preserved in clay, waited thousands of years to be uncovered. Piece by piece, the story re-emerged in the modern era. Astonishing archaeologists and historians, what fascinates us today is not only the boldness of Akhenaten's vision, but also its fragility. Here was one of the earliest known experiments in monotheism, the worship of a single god, centuries before Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. Yet it lasted less than 2 decades. It never took root in the hearts of ordinary Egyptians. Perhaps that was its greatest weakness. Religion in Egypt had always been woven into the fabric of life, in household shrines, in village festivals, in local temples. Akhenaten tried to uproot this tradition and replace it with a singular devotion to the sun disk. The idea was brilliant, but it lacked roots. It was light without shade, doctrine without memory. When you stand in the ruins of his city, you can almost sense the dissonance. The open-air temples, designed for eternal sunlight, now stand empty, shadows lengthening across their stones. The once bustling streets lie silent. A dream that once seemed destined to reshape eternity now rests as dust on the desert floor. And yet, the irony remains. In erasing him, later pharaohs ensured his uniqueness. Hatshepsut had been forgotten and rediscovered. So too with Akhenaten. By condemning him as a heretic, they preserved him as an anomaly. Today, he stands out precisely because his reign was so different. Americans may know Tutankhamun's glittering mask, but few know the reason his tomb mattered at all. It marked the undoing of his father's revolution. The The Golden Boy's fame rests on treasures buried in secrecy, while Akhenaten's legacy lies in ruins exposed to the sun. As you let this story settle, the question lingers in your thoughts. Was Akhenaten a visionary ahead of his time, or a dreamer who mistook his own obsessions for destiny? Did he glimpse the possibility of a world united by one divine light? Or did he simply weaken Egypt by stripping it of its traditions? The Aten no longer shines in temples, but the debate about Akhenaten's true intentions glows on, faint but enduring, like sunlight on broken stone. Story 3. Tutankhamun's forgotten daily life. Few picture the boy king, not inside his golden burial chamber, but in the slow routines of his palace. The world remembers Tutankhamun for the treasures of his tomb, the gleaming mask, the coffins layered in gold, the chariots, and the jewelry. Americans know him, if at all, as the boy king whose untouched burial dazzled archaeologists in 1922. Yet behind the glitter lay an ordinary existence, a life filled with routines, scribes, rituals, and quiet struggle. Tutankhamun came to the throne as a child, around 1332 BCE, following the turbulent reign of his father Akhenaten. He was perhaps 9 or 10 years old, barely able to write his own decrees, still learning to hold the crook and flail of kingship. His early reign was guided by advisors and priests who sought to undo Akhenaten's radical reforms, for daily life would not have been filled with grand decisions, but with training. Imagine him seated in a shaded courtyard, a reed brush in his hand, scratching hieratic script onto shards of pottery or flakes of limestone. Lessons in writing, history, and ritual would have been part of his mornings, guided by tutors who knew that every pharaoh had to embody knowledge as much as power. The boy also learned ceremony. Each day required him to appear before statues of the gods, offering incense, reciting prayers, pouring libations of water and wine. His small frame, dressed in fine linen, would stand before towering stone figures of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu. 4. The priests and courtiers watching these acts mattered far more than his age. The pharaoh was the living Horus, the divine intermediary. Whether boy or man, he had to perform the role, his meals, to reveal a kingdom's wealth in miniature. Archaeologists found in his tomb remains of bread, fruit, honey, wine, and meat, not banquets of excess, but steady nourishment. Each loaf was baked with care, often marked with stamps showing the name of the palace. Jars of beer, sweetened with dates, were daily staples. Dishes of duck, fish from the Nile, and cuts of beef or goat completed the diet. For Tutankhamun, these were not luxuries but expectations. The pharaoh ate what the land provided, symbols of Egypt's abundance, yet beneath these routines lay fragility. CT scans of his mummy show a boy with health struggles, a clubfoot, possible cleft palate, signs of malaria. Walking may have been painful. Chariots were found in his tomb, but it is doubtful he ever rode them in battle. Instead, he likely relied on canes, several of which were buried with him. Imagine the young king limping through his palace corridors, his steps uneven on cool stone floors polished by servants' hands. Outside the palace, Egypt was slowly shifting back toward tradition. Under his name, temples to Aten were closed, and the old gods restored. The boy's throne name itself changed from Tutankhaten, living image of Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, signaling the revival of the Amun priesthood. But did Tutankhamun himself decide this? Almost certainly not. His advisors, the experienced courtier, and Horemheb, the general, guided the kingdom's restoration. The boy king lent his name and presence. They wielded the power. Even so, Tutankhamun's daily duties would have reinforced this return to tradition. Each morning, he would be dressed by attendants in fresh linen, his head adorned with ceremonial crowns or circlets. He would walk slowly into temple courtyards, lifting incense toward the gods, repeating words fed to him by priests. Rituals may have been tedious to a child, but they were essential in presenting stability after the chaos of Akhenaten's reign in the evenings. Life in the palace unfolded with quieter details. Musicians played harps and flutes. Dancers moved in graceful lines, their bracelets jangling. Servants poured wine into cups of alabaster or faience. Tutors may have read aloud stories of earlier kings, teaching Tutankhamun his place in the long lineage of pharaohs. Even these moments were part of the education of a ruler, learning through entertainment, absorbing lessons through myth and song. For his young wife, Ankhesenamun, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, life must have been equally strange. She too was a teenager, married to stabilize the royal line. Reliefs show them together, the queen offering her husband flowers, the two seated beneath Aten's rays in early depictions, later before the restored gods of Thebes. Their marriage, though ceremonial, may have carried genuine companionship. After all, they were close in age, facing the burdens of kingship side by side. For the workers and artisans of Egypt, Tutankhamun's reign meant opportunity. The restoration of temples required stonecutters, painters, and builders. At Karnak, work resumed on sanctuaries abandoned during Akhenaten's rule. Scribes recorded deliveries of stone and wood, grain and cattle. Taxes flowed again into the temple treasuries, managed by priests whose ledgers filled with numbers. It was tedious work, but it brought stability to thousands of households. The boy king's image was everywhere. Small statues depicted him presenting offerings, bore his name. Reliefs showed him smiting enemies, though it was unlikely he ever led an army in person. This was the boring but essential propaganda of kingship. The pharaoh as eternal warrior, eternal priest, eternal child of the gods, even if the reality was a limping teenager learning how to read. And then there were the illnesses. Evidence suggests Tutankhamun suffered repeated bouts of malaria, weakening his body. Combined with congenital issues, his health must have been fragile. You can imagine him, some mornings, too weak to rise for ceremonies, lying on a couch while physicians examined him with poultices, herbs, and prayers. The weight of divine kingship pressed on a body that could barely carry itself. Yet Egypt endured. The harvests came. The Nile flooded. Temples filled with incense once more. And in the palaces, the boy king continued his education in rule. 2. The world outside, stability had returned. But to those inside the palace walls, the question remained. How long could such a fragile king sustain the weight of Pharaoh? You pictured the young king seated on a low throne, the polished wood inlaid with gold and faïences, his small feet barely touching the ground. Around him stand advisors, older men with lined faces and measured voices, guiding him through the endless business of kingship. Tutankhamun may have worn the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, but much of his reign was carried on the shoulders of others. Two names stand out: the seasoned courtier who had served Akhenaten and earlier pharaohs, and Horemheb, the military commander whose career spanned palace and battlefield alike. These men shaped the policies of the young king. Tutankhamun's role was ceremonial, essential in appearance, if not in practice. He was pharaoh in title, but in reality, the kingdom was steered by these experienced hands. The first order of business was restoration. After Akhenaten's radical devotion to Aten, Egypt needed to return to familiar ground. Temples abandoned during his father's reign were reopened. Statues of the old gods were repaired or recarved. Scribes carefully reinscribed the names of Amun, Osiris, and Ptah on walls where they had been chiseled away. It was slow, meticulous work, but every repaired inscription was a signal to the people. Tradition had returned. For Tutankhamun himself, this meant days filled with ceremonies of repair. Imagine him being carried in a gilded chair into the great courts of Karnak, the massive columns towering above. Priests in white linen awaited him, holding incense burners and jars of libation. The boy raised his hands, recited prayers taught by his tutors, and poured offerings before the restored statues. Every act was recorded by scribes. Every gesture echoed in hymns to the people. The sight of Pharaoh standing once more before the gods must have been reassuring. The Aten experiment had unsettled Egypt's rhythm. Now, the child king's rituals promised continuity, even if everyone knew the words were fed into his mouth by priests. Daily governance unfolded in quieter ways. In offices near the palace, scribes bent over papyrus rolls, tallying grain from the Nile Valley, recording taxes in neat columns of numbers. Workers delivered shipments of stone for temple repairs, their names entered into dusty ledgers. Farmers brought offerings from villagers, goats, jars of beer, baskets of onions. These details seemed dull, but they were the machinery of empire. Egypt survived not only through divine kingship, but also through lists, receipts, and endless records. Tutankhamun's seal was affixed to these decrees, though the decisions behind them came from Ai and Horemheb. Even so, the young king had to appear engaged. Each morning, scribes would read aloud petitions and reports. A border skirmish in Nubia, a shipment delayed in the delta, a temple roof needing repair. Tutankhamun would nod, perhaps ask a question, before his advisors issued the true commands. To the court, this performance mattered. It showed continuity of Pharaoh's authority, even if the substance lay elsewhere. Beyond administration, art and architecture also flourished in his name. Workshops produced statues showing the boy king offering to Amon. Temples bore reliefs of him, smiting enemies or receiving life from the gods. Craftsmen painted him with smooth skin and youthful grace, erasing any sign of frailty. These images were political tools, meant to reassure the nation. Pharaoh was eternal, even if this pharaoh limped with a cane. Meanwhile, Horemheb managed the military. Egypt's empire in Canaan and Syria had weakened during Akhenaten's reign. Enemies pressed at the borders. Horemheb led campaigns to restore order, carrying banners with Tutankhamun's name. Victories were attributed to the boy king, though it was the general who commanded. This was the duality of Tutankhamun's reign. His name crowned the triumphs, while others carried the burden. Inside the palace, life unfolded with quiet routine. The boy and his young wife Ankhesenamun lived among courtyards shaded by colonnades, surrounded by musicians, servants, and tutors. Reliefs show tenderness between them. Ankhesenamun offering her husband flowers, the two seated together as equals. In a world where pharaohs were usually shown distant and stern, these images hint at a more human side, perhaps in private, away from the weight of ritual. The two found comfort in each other, but fragility shadowed everything. Tutankhamun's health limited his movements. Walking across palace floors may have required assistance. He used canes daily. More than 100 were found in his tomb. Hunting scenes on painted chests show him triumphant, bow drawn, enemies defeated. Yet these were likely symbolic, not real. The boy king's body could not match the ideal his artists depicted. Even so, the rituals went on. Each festival, each offering, each procession reinforced the idea of divine kingship. The young pharaoh appeared in golden chariots, even if he never rode them into battle. He held the crook and flail of Osiris, even if his hands trembled. He wore the crowns of Egypt, even if his head was heavy with illness. And in the background, his advisors prepared. I positioned himself as the steady voice of tradition, ensuring the restoration of Amun's power. Horemheb positioned himself as the protector of Egypt's borders. Each step they took was careful, for both knew that the boy would not reign long. His fragility was plain to see. For the people of Egypt, Tutankhamun's reign felt like stability after chaos. Temples were alive again, festivals filled the air with music, trade routes hummed with activity. Farmers sowed, soldiers marched, scribes wrote, priests prayed. To most, it did not matter if the boy king himself gave commands. What mattered was that Pharaoh, the eternal institution, was restored. And yet, you cannot help but wonder, what did Tutankhamun think, sitting in his chambers, listening to advisors argue, his body aching, his youth slipping away? Did he know he was a figurehead? Did he accept it, or did he dream of ruling in truth one day? The records are silent, leaving only the artifacts, canes worn smooth by his hand, chariots perhaps never used, amulets for protection, and statues that show him strong when he was weak. They whisper of a life both royal and restrained, glorious in appearance but limited in reality. But in the quiet shadows of his reign, the fragility of his health and the ambitions of his advisors raise an unsettling thought. What would happen to Egypt when this fragile king was gone? The end of Tutankhamun's reign came quietly, without the grand drama that later surrounded his tomb. He was perhaps 18 or 19 years old, still in the early bloom of life, when his fragile body gave out. The cause remains uncertain. Even today, for centuries, speculation swirled. Was he murdered? Did he die from a chariot crash? Was it malaria, bone disease, or a combination of illnesses? CT scans of his mummy revealed a fractured skull, leading to theories of assassination. Later studies suggested the injury occurred after death, during rough handling in burial. His foot deformities and traces of malaria point instead to natural causes. A body worn down by weakness and disease. Whatever the reason, his death left Egypt in a precarious state. Tutankhamun had no surviving children. His wife, Ankhesenamun, still a teenager herself, was suddenly a widow with the weight of dynastic survival pressing on her shoulders. A letter found in the archives of the Hittite Empire tells a haunting story. She wrote to the Hittite king, begging him to send one of his sons to marry her, declaring, "I have no son. They say you have many. If you give me one, he will be my husband, and no one will oppose him." It was a desperate plea, and it reveals the uncertainty of the time. For a queen of Egypt to ask for a foreign prince was unthinkable, yet Ankhesenamun feared the ambitions of Tutankhamun's advisor, who soon took the throne for himself. The Hittite prince sent in response was killed on the way, perhaps, by Egyptian agents. Ankhesenamun vanished from history soon after, leaving us only with fragments of her story. But before these political intrigues unfolded, Tutankhamun's body had to be prepared. Priests worked quickly. His body was wrapped, in linen, amulets placed between the layers. He was laid in nested coffins, the innermost of solid gold. His face was covered by the mask that would one day become world famous. Around him were placed chariots, weapons, food, clothing, even toys. It was the standard equipment of a Pharaoh. Afterlife, scaled not for a mighty warrior, but for a boy king who had lived in shadow. The tomb itself was modest, perhaps not originally intended for a pharaoh. Its chambers were small, its decorations hurried. This has led many scholars to believe that his death came unexpectedly, leaving little time to prepare a grander resting place. Yet this very modesty preserved him. Larger tombs were looted in antiquity, their treasures scattered. Tutankhamun's, hidden and overlooked in the Valley of the Kings, remained sealed for over 3,000 years. For the Egyptians of his time, Tutankhamun's death must have felt anticlimactic. He had restored the gods, reopened temples, presided over festivals. But he left no heir, no lasting mark of conquest, no towering monuments of his own. His reign was short, his health frail, his power limited by advisors. When I, and later Horemheb, ruled in his name, they claimed his restoration as their own. Tutankhamun was almost forgotten, a small figure in the great expanse of Egypt's history. It was only in 1922, when Howard Carter opened his tomb, that his name roared back into the world. The golden mask, the dazzling treasures, the untouched burial, these captured imaginations far beyond Egypt. Americans, Europeans, the entire globe saw in him the glory of ancient Egypt condensed into one dazzling discovery. Ironically, in death, Tutankhamun became more famous than he ever was in life. But what about the boy himself? Beyond the mask, beyond the treasure, what was his life? The answer lies in the quiet fragments, a cane worn smooth by daily use, suggesting pain in every step. A handful of toys buried with him, hinting at youth cut short. Amulets for protection, evidence of fears that plagued his fragile body. Bread and beer sealed in jars, reminders that even in death, the routines of daily life mattered. Tutankhamun's forgotten daily life was not one of golden glory, but of quiet endurance. He rose each day to play the role of Pharaoh, supported by priests and advisors, his body weak but his image strong. He learned, he prayed, he endured ceremonies that must have been exhausting. He lived in the shadow of tradition, tasked with repairing the chaos of his father's revolution, yet without the strength to shape his own destiny. And yet, perhaps there is meaning in this ordinariness. His reign shows us that history is not always shaped by grand battles or towering monuments. Sometimes it is carried by fragile figures, by teenagers thrust into roles too heavy for their shoulders, by the machinery of advisors, scribes, and priests who keep the state turning even when the king falters. As you think of Tutankhamun's final days, you are left with an image not of the golden mask, but of a boy sitting with his wife in a shaded courtyard, a cane at his side, listening. Two musicians play as the sun sets over Thebes. A life small in scale, almost boring in its routine, but one that nonetheless held the weight of a kingdom. And so the question lingers, quiet and unresolved. Was Tutankhamun truly a king who mattered? Or was it only the accident of an unplanned tomb that gave him a place in our memory? Story 4. The Pharaoh who fought the Sea People's you. Picture the banks of the Nile, the reeds swaying gently in the breeze, the river flowing as it always had, but along its edges soldiers wait. They stand in orderly ranks, their shields gleaming, their spears pointed skyward, their sandals planted firmly in the sand. Behind them, the Pharaoh's banners ripple, each bearing the falcon of Horus and the royal cartouche of Ramesses III. To most Americans today, the name Ramesses III may not carry weight. He was not the great builder, Ramesses II, nor the golden boy, Tutankhamun, but in the early 12th century BCE, he was the pharaoh who defended Egypt against one of history's strangest and most shadowy threats, the Sea Peoples. Who were they? That remains a mystery even now. They appear suddenly in the records, a confederation of raiders and migrants moving by land and sea. Egyptian inscriptions call them by names like the Peleset, the Sherdon, the Shekelesh. Some may have been displaced from the Aegean, others from Anatolia or the Mediterranean islands. They came with ox-drawn carts, their families in tow, entire communities on the move. This was not just an army but a migration of peoples, armed and desperate. In the reliefs at Medinet Habu, Ramesses III's great mortuary temple, you can still see the scenes carved in stone. Ships clash in the Nile Delta, Egyptian archers firing from the banks while the Sea People's vessels tilt and topple. Warriors in feathered helmets wield swords and spears, while others cling to sinking ships. On land, carts rumble forward, women and children visible among the warriors. It was both an invasion and an exodus. But before those battles, there was the long preparation. Egypt had faced crises before, famines, rebellions, even the collapse of other kingdoms. But this was different. Entire nations seemed to be on the move, pushing south toward the fertile valley of the Nile. For Pharaoh, defense meant more than mustering soldiers. It meant logistics. Imagine the scribes hunched over their ledgers, recording grain deliveries to feed the army. Villagers along the Nile giving up goats, jars of beer, bundles of onions. Black ink smeared across papyrus, line after line of ration lists. Without food, no soldier could march, no fleet could sail. In shipyards, carpenters labored to repair Egypt's navy. Long wooden planks were steamed and bent into shape, lashed with rope, sealed with pitch. Oars were carved, sails stitched from linen. These were not fast warships, but steady vessels meant to hold archers and repel boarding attacks. The Nile itself would be Egypt's strongest ally. On land, engineers prepared fortifications. Trenches were dug in the delta, stakes driven into the earth, watchtowers raised. Messengers rode donkeys up and down the Nile, carrying orders sealed with the Pharaoh's ring. The machinery of defense churned quietly, line by line, list by list, 1,000 small tasks preparing for one great clash. For the ordinary Egyptian farmer, the signs of change were clear. Fields were harvested early, grain requisitioned for storage. Young men were called away from villages to serve as soldiers. Cattle were driven into enclosures, ready to be taken as supplies. The fear of an unknown enemy, arriving by sea, pressed down like the summer heat, and at the center of it all was Ramesses III. Reliefs show him as the eternal warrior, bow drawn, smiting enemies, trampling foes beneath his chariot wheels. But the reality was likely more mundane. Long councils with generals, endless reports from scouts, rituals performed in temples to secure the gods' favor. Pharaoh did not simply fight. He organized, he delegated, he commanded. His victories were born not just of strength, but of administration. The Sea Peoples, too, must have prepared. Their carts carried not only weapons but families, suggesting desperation as much as ambition. Droughts and famine may have driven them southward. Kingdoms across the Mediterranean were collapsing. The Mycenaeans, the Hittites, even you fell to flames. These wandering peoples sought new lands, and Egypt, with its fertile Nile, seemed a tempting prize. As the first reports reached Pharaoh's ears, scouts describing strange ships on the horizon, one can imagine the tension in his halls. The Nile was life. If invaders controlled the delta, Egypt would starve. And so the order went out. The army would meet them in the marshes, and the navy would block them on the river. The stage was set for one of Egypt's last great victories. But as you let this scene settle in your mind, the thought lingers. How did a civilization, already more than 1,000 years old, find the strength to hold back a tide that overwhelmed so many others? You picture the delta marshes, wide stretches of reeds and waterways, where the Nile fans into many mouths before meeting the sea. This was no open battlefield, but a labyrinth of channels, islands, and shallow waters, the perfect place for ambushes. Here, Ramesses III made his stand. The sea peoples came in waves, their ships crowding the horizon. Reliefs at Medinet show them with high prowed vessels, almost like floating fortresses, crowded with warriors in feathered helmets. Their swords were broad, their shields round, their movements fierce. These were not ragged raiders, but disciplined fighters, families and armies combined, carrying wagons and oxen on land, ships and sails on water. On the Egyptian side, preparations were precise. Archers lined the riverbanks, their bows strung and ready. Ships of Egypt formed ranks across the channels, their oarsmen steady, their decks filled with more archers. The Nile itself was the ally, its currents pushing against the invaders. The battle, as carved into stone, was both chaotic and controlled. Egyptian archers fired volleys from the banks, arrows raining onto enemy decks. The sea people's ships tilted under the assault, men falling into the water. Egyptian vessels rowed forward, ramming and trapping the intruders. In the carvings you can still see the sea peoples flailing in the water, their helmets bobbing, their bodies pierced by arrows. Some cling to capsized ships, others dragged ashore in chains. On land, the clash was no less intense. Migrant families had brought their carts southward, hoping to settle, but the Pharaoh's army met them head-on. Egyptian chariots swept across the plains, their wheels cutting grooves into the earth, their horses straining against the harness. Infantry advanced in ranks, shields locked, spears thrusting. The sea peoples fought back with determination, but Egypt's discipline and preparation held. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu boast of Pharaoh's triumph, those who came by the sea. Their bodies were heaped on the shore, those who came by land, they lay fallen in the fields. None escaped. It is propaganda, of course, carved to glorify Ramesses III, but there is truth in its details. Egypt survived. The invaders were defeated. The Nile Delta remained secure, yet the victory was not effortless. Behind every image of Pharaoh's smiting enemies lay the quiet machinery that made it possible. The scribes who tallied arrows and chariots, the workers who built ships, the farmers who supplied grain, the priests who performed rituals before battle, offering incense to Amen and Ra, chanting hymns for protection. Victory came not only from swords, but from lists, rations, and prayers. For the ordinary soldier, the battle would have been both terrifying and monotonous. Hours of waiting in marshes, swatting flies, standing knee-deep in mud, before the sudden roar of combat. Arrows hissing, oars splashing, shouts echoing. The stench of smoke and blood mixing with the sweet rot of reeds. And then, after the clash, the endless work of hauling prisoners, repairing ships, counting the dead. Egypt celebrated, of course. Festivals honored Pharaoh's triumph. Reliefs were carved to proclaim the eternal defeat of Egypt's enemies. Prisoners were paraded there, strange helmets and foreign features displayed as trophies of victory. The sea peoples who survived were sometimes absorbed into Egypt as laborers or mercenaries. Reminders of the battle etched into daily life, but the story was larger than Egypt alone. Across the Mediterranean, other kingdoms were not so fortunate. The Hittite Empire collapsed. Ugarit was burned. Mycenaean palaces fell into ruin. The sea peoples swept like a storm, leaving devastation in their wake. Only Egypt, under Ramesses III, held firm. This is what makes the reliefs at Medinet Habu so haunting. They are not merely propaganda, but records of survival. They show a world in collapse, a tide of migrants and warriors crashing against the walls of Egypt, and Egypt, ancient and enduring, holding the line, still. Beneath the celebration, there must have been unease. The sea peoples had been defeated, but at what cost? Egypt had spent vast resources, drained its coffers, strained its people. The Nile still flowed, the temples still stood, but the world beyond Egypt's borders was changing. The old order of empires was crumbling, and Egypt, though victorious, could not escape the tremors. And so, as you let the story unfold in your mind, you see both triumph and fragility. Ramesses III stood victorious, the sea peoples defeated, the delta secure. Yet the battle was not the dawn of renewal, but the last great blaze of Egypt's strength before centuries of decline. It leaves you with an unresolved thought. Did Ramesses III truly save Egypt, or did he merely buy it time, a fragile reprieve, against a tide that no kingdom could forever resist? The victory was carved in stone. At Medinet Habu, the reliefs stretch across walls like a visual hymn, Ramesses III towering above his enemies. The sea people scattered beneath his chariot, ships tilting, foreigners bound in chains. To Egyptians who gazed on these scenes, the message was clear. Pharaoh had protected the two lands, and Egypt still stood, eternal and unbroken. Celebration followed. Priests performed rituals of thanksgiving, offerings piled high on temple altars. Hymns to Aman resounded through Karnak, praising the god who had given Pharaoh strength. Processions filled the streets, captives paraded, their feathered helmets and strange dress marking them as outsiders. Ordinary Egyptians, who had feared famine and invasion, could breathe again. The Nile was safe, the harvest secure, and yet, beneath the celebration, something quieter stirred. Exhaustion. Wars are not fought only with arrows and swords. They are fought with grain, with labor, with the patience of workers and farmers whose daily lives bear the weight of empire. The sea peoples had been defeated, but Egypt had paid dearly. Records show that the war-strained resources, grain stores, were depleted to feed the army. Taxes weighed heavily on villagers already struggling with poor harvests. The price of victory was stability at home, but fragility beneath the surface. For the soldier returning from battle, there was no treasure, only rationed bread and the weariness of endless marching. For the farmer, there was no relief, only higher demands from scribes with their ledgers. The sea peoples themselves did not vanish. Some were settled in Egypt as prisoners or mercenaries, absorbed into the population. Others moved farther along the coasts of Canaan, leaving their mark on the region's history. Their assault on Egypt had failed, but their presence lingered. For Ramesses III, the battle was a crowning moment. He had defended Egypt when other empires fell, but his reign, though long, was troubled by more than foreign threats. Later years brought economic strain, corruption among officials, and even a harem conspiracy in which members of his household plotted to kill him. The details of that plot belong to another story, but together they show a kingdom under pressure. The battle with the Sea Peoples thus stands as both triumph and warning. Egypt had survived the late Bronze Age collapse, one of the few great powers to endure, but survival came at cost. The wealth that once built pyramids and temples now trickled into defense and repair. The power of Pharaoh, once unshakable, relied more and more on appearances. Reliefs carved, hymns sung, victories proclaimed. Even as the foundation weakened, you can still stand in Medinet Habu today, beneath the towering walls, and trace the carved ships locked in combat. The details remain vivid: the curve of a bow, the feathers of a helmet, the oars dipping into imagined water. They remind us of Egypt's resilience, but also its vulnerability. This was not the expansionist Egypt of earlier centuries, reaching into Asia and Nubia with bold campaigns. This was Egypt on the defensive, holding the line against forces it could not fully control. For ordinary Egyptians, what mattered was simpler. The Nile still flooded, the fields still bore grain, the temples still opened their doors at dawn. Life went on, though with heavier burdens. Families still baked bread, brewed beer, raised children, whispered prayers. The machinery of daily life continued, as it always had, quietly sustaining a civilization even as the world around it changed. And that may be the true legacy of Ramesses III's battles. He did not save Egypt forever, no one could, but he preserved its rhythm for another generation. He bought time for scribes to write, for artisans to carve, for farmers to sow, for priests to chant. In the face of collapse elsewhere, Egypt endured, not in glory but in survival. As you drift into thought, you are left with an image of the Nile Delta after the battles. The smoke is cleared, the ships lie broken, the bodies buried. Farmers return to their fields, bending over the soil. Scribes return to their ledgers, dipping reed pens into ink. Priests return to their temples, lighting incense once more. Pharaoh's victory was not only on the battlefield, but in restoring these small routines. The ordinary rhythms that made Egypt, Egypt, and the question lingers, unresolved. When history remembers a civilization, is survival itself the greatest victory? Story 5. The Pharaoh buried with ships in the sand. You picture the plateau of Giza, the desert sun beating down on pale limestone blocks. The Great Pyramid towers above you, its angles sharp, its mass overwhelming. Tourists today see it as a monument of stone, an eternal triangle against the sky. But hidden beneath the sand at its base lay something stranger, quieter, almost forgotten. Great wooden ships, dismantled and buried in pits beside the king's tomb. Khufu, also known as Cheops, reigned around 258–92566 BCE. He is remembered for commissioning the Great Pyramid, but his funeral preparations extended far beyond stone. At the pyramid's southern side, archaeologists uncovered long, narrow trenches, boat pits. Inside, carefully stacked and disassembled, lay timbers of cedar wood, ropes, and oars. These were not miniature models or symbolic carvings. They were full-sized ships, capable of sailing the Nile or even venturing into the Red Sea. The discovery of the first boat in 1954 startled the world. Buried in more than 1,000 pieces, the ship was painstakingly reconstructed. When assembled, it stretched over 140 feet long, its planks lashed together with rope in the ancient Egyptian style. The craftsmanship was exquisite. The cedar imported from Lebanon, though buried for 4,500 years, the boat looked as if it could still float. Why would a pharaoh bury ships beside his pyramid? The answer lies in Egyptian belief. The afterlife was not a vague dream, but a structured journey. The dead king was thought to travel with the sun god Ra across the heavens in a celestial bark. At night, he joined Ra in navigating the underworld, battling chaos before rising again at dawn. To prepare for this eternal voyage, Khufu buried ships in the desert, ready to carry him across the cosmic waters. But the details, as always, are as fascinating as the belief. The timbers were disassembled before burial, stacked in a way that suggested not just symbolism but practicality. Perhaps these ships had been used in life, carrying the king along the Nile, transporting stone for his pyramid, or sailing to religious ceremonies. The idea that a vessel which once touched the Nile now lay waiting in the desert adds a haunting dimension, a tool of daily life, transformed into a tool for eternity. The pits themselves were plain, rectangular trenches cut into bedrock and sealed with massive limestone slabs. To an observer at the time, they may have looked like nothing more than foundations or empty spaces beside the pyramid. Only those initiated into the rituals of kingship would know their true contents. Imagine the day of burial, priests chanting, incense burning, workers lowering timbers carefully into the pit, stacking planks, coiling ropes, sealing the slabs. No announcement, no grand parade, just quiet, methodical preparation for a journey beyond life. When archaeologists opened the sealed pit in the 20th century, they found not only the cedar planks, but also ropes twisted from grass, oars still, carved smooth, wooden dowels used to join the hull. Every detail spoke of precision. It was as if time itself had paused, holding the ship in readiness for thousands of years. For the Egyptians who built these ships, the work may have felt routine. Carpenters measured and cut, laborers hauled, scribes recorded deliveries of wood and rope. Day after day, under the sun, they worked not for themselves, but for a pharaoh's eternity. It was boring work, fitting pegs, tightening lashings, smoothing planks. Yet each task carried the weight of cosmic significance. What is striking is the choice of material. Cedar from Lebanon was rare and valuable. Transporting it across the eastern Mediterranean required trade networks, diplomacy, and careful planning. These ships were not casual objects, but symbols of wealth, power, and far-reaching connections. Each plank buried beside Khufu's pyramid whispered of forests far beyond Egypt, of craftsmen in distant lands, of ships sailing across seas to deliver wood for a king's eternal journey. And then there is the silence. For millennia, no one remembered these pits. Sand covered them, winds scoured their edges, the desert reclaimed them. Visitors in later centuries marveled at the pyramid, but never guessed that ships lay hidden beneath their feet. Even when explorers mapped Giza in the 19th century, the pits went unnoticed. It took chance and persistence for them to be rediscovered. So you stand now in your imagination beside the pyramid, the air hot and dry, and picture not just stone but wood, fragile, perishable wood, waiting beneath slabs of limestone. Ships that once touched water, now resting in sand. Kingship in Egypt was not only about monuments, but also about preparation. a readiness for the voyage beyond, a belief that eternity required boats as surely as it required tombs. And the question rises, unresolved, did Khufu truly believe he would sail these ships across the heavens, or were they a gesture of power, a reminder to all who saw his pyramid that even in death, Pharaoh commanded fleets? You picture the Giza Plateau again, but now not in the age of Khufu, but in the dust and heat of 1954. Archaeologists, workers, and engineers crowded around the base of the Great Pyramid. Their tools were not chisels of copper, but picks and shovels of iron. Their work was not for Pharaoh, but for history. That year, while clearing debris south of the pyramid, workers uncovered something unusual, a series of massive limestone blocks set into the ground, carefully sealed. Beneath them lay a rectangular pit, undisturbed for over 4,500 years. As the stones were lifted, a smell of cedar filled the air, the scent of ancient Lebanon carried across millennia. Inside, the archaeologists found not a single intact boat, but more than 1,200 pieces of wood, planks, ribs, oars, and ropes, all disassembled and stacked like a giant puzzle. It was the funerary boat of Khufu, buried with him for his journey into eternity. Reconstructing it was no easy task. The pieces had to be documented, studied, and carefully fitted together. Egyptian restorer Ahmed Youssef must have felt both awe and weariness as he spent more than a decade assembling the craft, plank by plank, peg by peg. It was like piecing together a 4,000-year-old jigsaw puzzle, with no manual, only the logic of ancient shipbuilders to guide him. The work revealed extraordinary craftsmanship. The planks were made of imported cedar, joined not with nails, but with rope lashings that allowed the hull to flex in the water. The ship measured 43 meters, about 142 feet, with a sleek, narrow profile ideal for river travel. Its prow and stern curved gracefully upward, like the crescent of the moon laid flat on the Nile. When completed, it was not only a funerary symbol, but a fully functional vessel, one that could still float today. Imagine the patience required, day after day, in a workshop filled with the smell of ancient wood. Conservators lifted planks, measured their edges, matched them to corresponding joints. Every mistake risked damage. Every success brought the boat closer to life. The task was tedious, but it mirrored the ancient Egyptians' own devotion to detail. What had once been the boring work of Pharaoh's carpenters became the boring work of modern archaeologists, each step preserving history for future generations. And what did the ship reveal? More than belief in the afterlife. It showed the technological sophistication of Old Kingdom Egypt. These were not primitive rafts, but advanced wooden vessels, constructed with an understanding of hydrodynamics and strength. Egypt was not only a land of stone, but of sailors. The Nile was its highway, carrying grain, stone, people, and ideas. Khufu's boat symbolized this central truth. To rule Egypt was to command the river. But perhaps the most surprising detail is this: the boat may have been used in life before it was buried. Scratches on the planks suggest wear from water and ropes. Some scholars believe it carried Khufu's body across the Nile during his funeral, from the eastern bank to Giza. Others argue it may have been part of ceremonial processions during his reign. Either way, it was not just a symbol, but a working ship, transformed into a vessel of eternity. As the boat was reconstructed, a second mystery arose. Nearby, another sealed pit was discovered, still unopened for decades to protect its contents. Only in 2011 did archaeologists begin to examine it with modern techniques. carefully extracting pieces with the help of Japanese specialists. The second boat, too, lay in fragments, waiting to tell its story. Together, the two ships suggest a fleet for the afterlife, perhaps representing journeys across both earth and heaven. For ordinary Egyptians of Khufu's time, the boats would have been a distant symbol. Few ever saw them once they were buried. But they knew the Nile intimately, its floods shaping their lives, its boats carrying their grain and their taxes. To them, Pharaoh's ships were simply the divine version of their own, larger, grander, eternal, but still part of the same river-borne reality. The rediscovery in the 20th century was not just an archaeological event, but a cultural one. Egyptians themselves, standing in the presence of the cedar planks, could feel a direct link to their ancestors. Tourists marveled at the size and preservation. Historians studied the ship for clues to ancient trade. Each plank became more than wood. It became a conversation across time. And yet, even as the boat sits reconstructed in a museum, questions remain. Was it truly meant to sail the heavens, or was it buried as a show of wealth and power? Was Khufu preparing for the afterlife, or was he demonstrating that even in death, his command of fleets and foreign resources endured? You imagine walking now into the boat museum that once stood beside the pyramid, the cedar vessel resting in its cradle. The silence of the room wraps around you, and the curved hull rises like the skeleton of a giant fish. It is at once practical and mystical, ordinary and extraordinary. A ship that once may have touched the Nile, now forever at rest in the desert, and the thought lingers. Did Khufu expect to sail these boats across the stars? Or was their burial itself the voyage, a final statement of power, carved not in stone, but in wood? You picture the boat fully reconstructed, its cedar planks smooth, its prow curving upward, resting quietly on display. To modern eyes, it feels miraculous. Stone pyramids endure, yes, but stone was meant to last. Wood, on the other hand, decays, rots, burns. And yet here is a ship 4,500 years old, surviving through the simple act of being buried in sand. The legacy of Khufu's boats stretches in several directions. First, they remind us of Egypt's connections beyond its borders. Cedar from Lebanon was not native. Its presence at Giza tells us that even in the Old Kingdom, Egypt reached outward, trading, negotiating, and commanding resources from foreign lands. To build such ships required not just carpenters and rope makers, but also diplomats, sailors, and traders. A funerary boat buried in the desert carried within it the echoes of mountains far away. Second, the boats illuminate the daily labor behind Pharaoh's glory. Thousands of workers cut, hauled, and shaped limestone for the pyramid. Alongside them, carpenters measured planks, drilled holes, twisted ropes, and tested joints. The work was monotonous, lash after lash of rope, peg after peg hammered into place, yet it built something both practical and eternal. For the laborers, the boats may have been just another task assigned by foremen. For Khufu, they were steps toward immortality. The boats also carry symbolic weight in the Egyptian understanding of time. To the ancient mind, life was not linear, but cyclical, like the daily rising of the sun. Each morning, Ra sailed his bark across the heavens. Each evening, he descended into the underworld. Pharaoh, as the son of Ra, was expected to join this voyage after death. The boats buried at Giza made this cycle tangible. They were not models, but real ships, ready for a real journey, a blending of the mundane and the divine. When archaeologists reconstructed the boat, they noticed signs of use. scratches on planks, ropes worn smooth. This suggests the ship may have carried Khufu himself in ceremonies, or perhaps transported his body during his funeral. If true, then the same ship that touched the Nile in life also sailed with him into eternity. A vessel that once creaked under the weight of oarsmen and cargo became a silent guardian of his afterlife. There is another layer of irony here. The Great Pyramid has lost much of its casing stones, its gleaming white surface stripped away over centuries. Its peak is rough, its sides weathered. Yet the boat, made of fragile wood, lies nearly perfect, its planks intact, its form whole. In trying to preserve eternity through stone, Khufu left behind a monument that eroded. In entrusting eternity to wood, he left us something unexpectedly alive. This contrast speaks to the nature of history itself. What survives is not always what we expect. Whole kingdoms vanish without a trace. Entire libraries are lost in fire. And yet a wooden ship, disassembled and hidden, waits quietly for discovery. The boat pits remind us that fragility sometimes outlasts permanence. For modern Egypt, the discovery of Khufu's boats became a source of pride and connection. Schoolchildren visited the museum, gazing at the cedar planks as if they were touching their ancestors' hands. Tourists marveled, scholars debated, carpenters studied ancient techniques. The boat was no longer just Khufu's. It belonged to all who sought meaning in the past. And yet, questions remain unresolved. Were the ships truly meant to sail the heavens, or were they symbolic gestures, demonstrations of Pharaoh's ability to command distant resources? Did Khufu intend to use them in rituals, or were they buried unused, built only for death? The evidence suggests both practical vessels, transformed into cosmic ones. As you reflect, you might imagine the workers who lowered the final limestone slabs over the pit. Did they know that they were sealing not just a boat, but a story that would travel across 45 centuries? Did they guess that one day strangers from lands they could not imagine would open the pit, inhale the scent of cedar, and marvel at their work? The ships endure as quiet teachers. They tell us that Egypt was not just pyramids and stone, but also wood, rope, and the patience of hands. They tell us that power lay not only in war and monuments, but in the dull, steady logistics of trade, carpentry, and transport. They tell us that the afterlife was imagined not as a vague dream, but as a voyage, one that required real vessels to set sail. And finally, they leave us with a thought. If fragile wood can outlast eternal stone, what else in history has been quietly waiting, buried in unexpected places, ready to remind us that survival often belongs to the overlooked?